Obviously, big, huge story. They're just pounding it as hard as they can of this shooting in France, in Toulouse, where a rabbi and 3 children were killed. And let me say up front, anytime innocent parties are killed by anybody, it is a tragedy and a shame. Period. End of discussion. But look at how the media is treating this thing. Last week, an American soldier or soldiers, depending upon who you're talking to, killed 16 innocent civilians, including 9 children, and it's treated like, no big deal, these kind of things happen. Crazed, lone, not American soldier, it's just really feel sorry for him, and that's the end of the story. 3 children get shot in France, and it's a big thing. It's the big news thing. Oh, how horrible it is there. Sarkozy's out there saying, there's a monster on the loose. By the way, have you noticed how the story has mutated? Originally, they were neo-Nazis inspired by, Breivik up there in Norway. They were neo-Nazis, and they even had a picture of the guy they said had done it, and he's in a neo-Nazi uniform with his 2 buddies doing that whole Sig Heil thing. Now, all of a sudden, it's back to the Muslims. So Sarkozy's out there screaming, there's a monster on the loose, and everybody's pounding this for every bit of propaganda value they can get. They're going crazy over there in France. And they may have a reason to. Little side note here. 50 years ago, there was this very strange story called The Cursed Bread of Pont Saint-Esprit, where the residents of this town just went through this horrible experience of visions and hallucinations. It turns out the U.S., the CIA, was conducting one of their LSD experiments, and they did it over there in that France village. So if you are in that part of France and people are acting a little strange, they have a reason. Cut them some slack. They're victims of the MK Ultra situation. But getting back to this situation over there in France, everybody is just pounding this thing, how horrible it was. And yes, it's horrible. Okay, but if there's a monster on the loose in France, then there are monsters on the loose in Afghanistan. And if killing 3 children in France is a horrible tragedy deserving the world's condemnation, then killing 9 children in Afghanistan deserves no less. And this is a case study in how the media will spin the news to favor a certain point of view. Now, there's this interesting situation going on in Europe with Baroness Ashton, who made the same point that I just made, that innocent children being killed anywhere is a tragedy, whether it's France or Afghanistan or Gaza. And, of course, Israel's, cheerleaders just are in a fury. No, you can't draw a line of equivalency between 3 children killed in France who are Jewish and those non-Jewish children killed by Israelis in Palestine. Okay, so we got 3 kids who died in France, and that's a tragedy. But the Israelis have killed 1,463 Palestinian children in Gaza since September 29th, 2000, and nobody seems to really make a big deal about it. Yeah, that's okay. Remember last week, the IDF shot a Palestinian child 5 times in the thigh. That's torture for being in the exclusion zone. So let us get a little sense of equivalence here. We'll be right back.
Here is your host, Michael Rivero.
And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show here. And as long as we're talking about that ugly situation down in Afghanistan, as you know, there is a difference in official story from the U.S. government versus the Afghani people. And given that the Afghani people have never lied to us about Saddam's weapons of mass destruction, I tend to go with their version of the story, which was that there were 15 to 20 soldiers, including air support, that killed these 16 civilians, including the 9 children. The story we are now getting out of the official Afghan investigation is that the people in this village were warned ahead of time. They were threatened ahead of time by U.S. troops regarding a roadside bomb that had happened in their village. And apparently the witnesses say the troops rounded up all the men from these 2 villages after the roadside bombing, lined them up against a wall, and told them they would pay a price for the attack. Now, have you ever heard the phrase kin punishment? It's the phrase the Nazis used when they would go into a town where some unknown party had taken a shot at a Nazi officer, and they would just murder everybody. It's collective punishment is what we're talking about here. This is Nazi tactics the U.S. government is using. And they're trying to hide it from you with this crazed lone nut sergeant cover story that is lame in the extreme. The U.S. government went into Afghanistan, into these villages, and just started killing people collectively to punish them for a roadside bombing that nobody knows who did it. It's Nazi tactics. The U.S. government is the Fourth Reich. And people are very upset about it. How wonderfully lucky for the U.S. government that this shooting in Toulouse comes along just in time to take Afghanistan's massacre off the front pages. How incredibly lucky for the U.S. government that happened. How incredibly lucky for Israel. It drives that kid who got shot in the thigh 5 times off the newspaper headlines. Isn't it amazing how every time Israel and the U.S. government get into trouble, there's always an atrocity that happens someplace else just perfectly timed to save them from a public relations disaster? It's eerie. I tell you, it's just eerie how that keeps happening. And it's very, very frustrating. All right, I want to talk about over in the Mideast, in the war zone, where they're trying to get big mistake number 3 really cranked up into overdrive in time to distract us all from the collapsing economy and all the other wars that aren't going very well. Basically, following on the pattern of Libya, it looks like NATO, which is really just sort of becoming a rubber stamp for U.S. imperialism, Israeli imperialism, is basically destabilizing the entire region. Bit by bit by bit, all of these nations are being thrown into chaos, and then in the midst of the chaos, the U.S. invades under some pretext or another. And we really are into World War III here. And the question is, how intense is it going to get? And I think the reason that, at least for the moment, they've backed off of Iran is the risk that they could get into a prolonged conflict with China or Russia and just lose through attrition. I think the U.S. government understands that victory is not guaranteed, and they're trying to optimize their chances, and they still think they can figure out a way to sort of finesse a victory, and I don't think they can. I don't think they can at all. Meanwhile, more and more of these so-called pro-democracy non-governmental organizations, the NGOs, are being exposed as basically CIA fronts. These NGOs promoting democracy in these countries are being outed one by one as intelligence fronts, intelligence operations, spy operations. And a lot of that has to do with the digital age and the fact that activists on the ground who are catching these people doing these things are coming out and saying this is what's going on. This is why there was that situation in Iran where they arrested those Americans from the non-governmental organization. They're rolling up a spy network, is what they're doing. Now, we were talking the other day about this war game regarding an Israeli attack on Iran, which for some reason our government says inevitably would mean the U.S. would have to enter the war. And I fail to see the argument for that. Why are we obligated to help Israel in their wars against a third party who has done no wrong to the United States whatsoever? But that's a side issue. Basically, the existence of the war game seems to underscore the fact that Israel is going to attack Iran, even though 80% of their own population are against this idea. But they're going to go ahead and they're going to do it, and the U.S. is going to get sucked into it. So what we have here is a war being started and directed by a tiny minority of the population, even smaller than the 1% who run the economy. And they just sort of expect that you and I and the Iranian people and the Israeli people will just go along with throwing their children into the meat grinder, because that makes profits for the defense contractors, it makes profits for the bankers who are loaning the money for our own self-destruction. And that's the way it's always been, so we're just going to keep on doing it. And they really think you're just going to believe with that thing. There's an interesting little Facebook page that was started by a group of people in Israel, basically broadcasting to the world, we do not support an attack on Iran. And there are a lot of Iranian people who are getting around the silicon curtain that's trying to be drawn around Iran, basically come to the Facebook page and say, we understand and we appreciate what you're saying. So you've got the Iranian people and the Israeli people reaching out, hands across cyberspace to each other, saying, we think this is a really bad idea. The leaders don't want to listen. They want to have their war. And it's up to us to stop them. They can't stop themselves. They're addicted. We'll be right back. Getting back to the Middle East and all the kerfuffle over there, Iran has now backed off its threat to close the Strait of Hormuz, not because the U.S. was angry about it or anybody else, but the other oil nations in the region were basically saying, why would you harm us in the middle of your argument with the United States? And Iran has basically backed off and said, you are right, and we will not close the Strait of Hormuz in the event of a conflict with the United States of America. So that excuse for an attack, preemptive attack on Iran, is now gone. Because our government was running around saying, they're threatening to close the Strait of Hormuz. We should just attack them on the basis of that. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show here. And we're talking about all the stuff that's going on over there in the Middle East. And here's an interesting little story. You've been probably hearing a lot about all these sanctions the U.S. has imposed on Iran. You may not use the dollar. You may not do this. You may not do that. And as you probably have been following in recent weeks, these kind of backfired. Because Iran is actually exporting more oil than it did before, and it's exporting it for currencies that are not the dollar. And it's great for Iran. It's great for the nations that are continuing to do business with Iran, and it's threatening to crash the economies of every nation that went along with these sanctions. So very quietly, and they hoped you weren't going to notice, the United States exempted 11 nations from its sanctions. In Japan and 10 nations of the European Union are now exempt from the United States-Iran sanctions. The U.S. government is still engaged in the sanctions, so your gas prices are going to go up. But in her serene magnanimity, U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton announced that these 11 nations, Belgium, Britain, Czech Republic, France, Germany, Greece, Italy, Japan, the Netherlands, Poland, and Spain, are now off the hook. They can go back to doing business with Iran. But we're going to go on sanctioning them here to just prove how tough that we are. Now, it's interesting that Secretary of State Hillary Clinton is running around telling these nations what they can and cannot buy. She seems to think she's a dictator. Emphasis on the dick. But for all the talk about sanctions and controlling Iran's nuclear program, well, Iran is still sanctioned, sort of, kind of, maybe, but not really. It's a joke. We're going to sanction you. Actually, no, we're not. Talk about hoisting with your own petard. Getting back over to the Middle East, interesting story out of Israel. Apparently, there is some kind of a mild epidemic of illness moving through the rabbis of Israel. Could be a flu. Who knows? Doesn't seem to be that serious. But Rabbi Steinman is blaming it all on Ahmadinejad and Iran's nuclear program. That the illnesses hitting the rabbis are a sign from God that they all need to start praying harder for the destruction of Iran. Just getting a little weird out there. Meanwhile, Russia has denounced Israel's repeated violation of Lebanese airspace. There are numerous United Nations resolutions telling Israel, please do not fly your warplanes across the border into Lebanon. That's a violation of their sovereign airspace. It is technically an act of war. And Israel just goes on doing it, saying, we'll just go with our warplanes anywhere we feel that we ought to. And now Russia's basically coming in and saying, we agree with Lebanon. This is unacceptable behavior. So there's another confrontation brewing over that. It's just always Israel provoking, Israel sending their warplanes where they're not supposed to go, Israel shooting children in the thigh 5 times, Israel killing 1,400 Palestinian children, and then getting upset when somebody talking about the 3 children dead in France mentions the fact that Palestinian children are being killed on a regular basis. And it's just so completely one-sided and biased. Our dead children are important to the world, and the other people's dead children, why are you even mentioning them? Or so goes the conventional wisdom here.